Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. Um, yeah, I think it's really important that we're able to talk about our own experiences for the folks that may be in school now or that may be thinking about school and also just work in general. But also I think it's important that we are able to share it so we can, amongst our own peer group, just know what each other is up to and then maybe learn from that, as we decide how or where we want to go to. So yeah, on that, I prepared a few images. I don't want to call them slides, but a few images that I would like us to just go through, talk about. Um, Most of it has to do with like my personal journey through architecture and like what has in a way led to where I am now. So bear with me. And then the second part is about a project which I think maybe exemplifies this idea of courage, the theme of the conference, because I think we find ourselves in a profession that really needs a lot of that. Like you need to have a lot of courage, to be able to get where you want to get to. So yeah, I hope that comes across. I'll share my screen now. So yeah, I start from this image because I think where I am now has a large part to do with my senior high school education. And this was a picture that was taken. You can probably guess where I am, right? In this picture. But I did visual arts for 3 years. So I did the fine arts and some of the applied arts, so painting, sculpture, graphic design. I did, yeah, general knowledge in arts as well. So I think that was really important in framing how I began to think about architecture when I entered architecture school, and also much later when I was like further down the line in architecture school. It's important to note that I had not planned to do visual arts when I was going to high school. I was more interested in the sciences, but there was a mix-up somewhere. At least that's how the story goes. And I was in a way put into the visual arts department. So it wasn't necessarily something that I chose. But then because of how rigid, the Ghana system is, it's like I had to ride that wave when it came. So I devoted myself to it. I spent a lot of nights just trying to, get good at drawing because it was very difficult for me at the time, in the beginning at least. But then, gradually I began to get a hang of it. This is me, I think maybe in my second year working on this sculpture. I still have this sculpture actually, by the way. So we made it from clay and then we baked it. And you can see this is an old kitchen. So it wasn't like a very pleasant space to work in necessarily. But I think, at least for me and my cohort, it was the hardness of it, or like the unfinished nature of it, made us a bit more creative because we had to kind of put everything together from the scratch. We made our own tools that we would use to make the sculpture. So I think there was a lot of thinking and like creativity in that process, even though I didn't necessarily realize it at that point, So yeah, this was after. So I have a bit of echo here. So okay, perfect. Yeah. So after my high school, I came to architecture school, and I think the reason for that was I wanted something that would merge both the arts and the sciences. And at the time, I was lucky enough to have this guy who came to me from the university. He was doing architecture in KUST at the time. So he came and then told me that, oh, if that's what I want to do, then I should just apply for architecture. So in a way, it was a no-brainer. So I did the application and then got into KNUST. This is a picture of my second year. We're designing a courthouse, I believe. And then, yeah, I think my time at KNUST was very trying to find a way to describe it in a way that sums up the experience. There was a lot of emphasis on like technicality. So trying to make a building work technically. was a lot of the focus. And you could see it in how we were expected to produce plans, sections, elevations, and then maybe one single sheet of conceptuals. I think all that speaks to a certain way in which we were trained. It wasn't necessarily about the backstory of the building. It was more about, the physical thing. And I think there's a lot of value in that, don't get me wrong. But I think by focusing exclusively on the physical thing, you also leave all the actual things that lead to the building being made, right? So there's a lot of history and like finances and abstract things that lead to the physical thing being built. And that wasn't necessarily the focus of the education I had in KNUST. So I found I was lacking. So I tried to find, that other side of architecture, like different spaces, mainly through internships. So this is me as an intern second year, and this was with Mobius Architecture in Accra. And I'm thankful for the experience because it was, I think, the first time that, this architect was, at least to me, this Ghanaian architect was talking about doing things in a bit of a different way. So yes, it was an architecture internship, but we weren't designing buildings. We're actually building furniture, like functional furniture. And so we had to do the whole trip to Makola, go look for the wood, get everything, put it on the truck, negotiate with the drivers, bring it to the site where we were going to build this. The site was in Tesano, by the way. There's this building by another firm that was using a lot of wood. So we were working with the wood expert who was like advising us on these pieces that we were making. But I highlighted just to show, I think it was like a pivotal moment for me in how I was thinking about architecture. It opened up a range of possibilities for, what architecture could be. And I think that was very important for me in like, thinking about it. So now I can look back and be like, that was that moment when I began, I don't know, reading several texts and articles about random things and then trying to think of how they applied to architecture. But yeah, fast forward after my undergrad, I joined this office in Accra, Ajaya Associates. This was the team that I was with, and this picture was taken when they were sending me off after my year working with them. It was also, I think, a very important experience. It was very busy and like a lot of work. I remember there was a time I was on like 6 different projects at once, and it was very, I don't know. I wouldn't say that was a typical experience for everyone, but personally, at least how I try to move through spaces is to say yes to many things. So for example, if I was given a task, can you do this exercise? Can you maybe quickly change this plan to look like this or reflect this instead of that? I would kind of say, like, I would just say yes without necessarily knowing how it would be done and a little figure it out. So I think doing that made me appear as someone who would just get anything done. And so it's like, if you have someone who's just willing to get anything done, you just give whatever you want to be done to that person, right? And it is tiring, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, you learn so much in a relatively short amount of time. So I mean, in the beginning, some of the things I was quite concerned about were like the softwares, and I was like, oh, I need to learn, this Rhino, Revit, whatever. But in like 1 month, you learn everything, right? So yeah, it's not, you realize that technicalities of learning software isn't actually that pressing, or isn't actually that, it's not the biggest problem in the world, really. But once I move beyond that, they put me on like different roles. So I had like meetings with clients, meetings with and these are like very huge clients, by the way, because these were very big projects. I was in meetings with the British Museum, like MPs, and I'm saying it so you have a sense of how, these sorts of big projects come together. And I think it was quite important to have the experience, because I'm not sure if I would get that experience necessarily anywhere else. There are some firms that are able to, do, and how those roles opened me up to learning all these like skills that I now have and can do anything with. So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, what I can do is maybe talk about how my experience has been, and then it doesn't have to be experience will go. I think it actually will never happen that my experience becomes your experience. But I think what could help is that what this could do is that it may show you that, oh, there is this possible, and then maybe that helps you in thinking about what you do. And so yeah, just keep that as we're going through this. But yeah, the time at a J Associates was really helpful. Like I learned to write emails, and yeah, like emails is a thing that you need to learn how to do, right? So from something as basic as that to say something super complex like I don't know, speaking to the civil engineer for a museum project and like, defending or clarifying the project to him. It gets very complex in certain stages. All that I had to do. So I think that was good. But I think if I had stayed more than a year, I might have started to feel a bit of the burnout because, like I said, it was a lot of work. So I think it came at a good time when I left and then went for my grad school. So this is me maybe on like the first day in front of the school. I was very excited, as you can see. I was like, posing in front of the school and then taking a picture. So yeah, I'll speak a bit about the application process, and maybe if you have like questions, you can ask me after. But I initially wasn't going to apply to say this school or for that matter any school in the US. I was more thinking along the European lines. And my reason was because, if you've seen the fees for American universities, you know how expensive they are, right? So I was like, okay, I'm not going to do any US schools. But then I think in like the last 2 weeks of the application cycle for the American schools, someone that informed me that because of COVID, they were no longer taking the GRE exam, which is like a standard aptitude test exam that they require of anyone who's trying to do a master's there. So it's like an English and a math thing. You can compare it to the SAT, but for grad school, right? Exactly. So in the end, I decided to apply to this school, MIT, and then Yale School of Architecture. Those were the only two schools I applied to. I got in both, but then what became my deciding factor was the money. So I think it was in this process that I realized that, actually in the US, even though they have very high tuition fees, the very big schools also have a lot of scholarship money, essentially. So the trouble really was like getting in, or it's like getting in. But once you get in, it's like they actually have a lot of money for you to come. So that was my case with MIT. They gave me a lot of money to cover almost everything. And so I just, it was a no-brainer. I said yes, and I went. Yeah. And if I were to, I don't know, describe my time at MIT, I would say it's been, in a way, the complete opposite of what KNUST has been. And I say complete opposite in terms of the content of the education or the courses. So whereas KNUST was very technically oriented and it was about plans and sections, in the school they couldn't care less about all that. It was very much about your ideas and how you were thinking about things, from a very, very large scale macro level where you were discussing the politics and the global implications of a single move on Earth. But yeah, so from that very large scale to like the small scale of like how a boat comes together, like a boat and an oars comes together to tie a certain element in place. So in that it was very comprehensive. Every week I do like I don't know, 6 to 8 different readings and like articles. For those of you that went to KNUST, I'm not sure if you remember or if you ever went through Kuten, Dr. Kuten, and what was that thing called, where you read some text and then you write a page or something?
Expose.
Expose, exactly, yeah. Those exposés. I remember doing it in the first year or the first, I think it was just the first semester in KNUST. And then we all like, stopped doing it. But here I was doing that every week, and with very, very complex texts. These weren't, your standard articles like BBC News. No, no, no. is like, heavy academic thinking. So it's like you read a paragraph, you're like, I don't know what that means. And then you read it again and again and again, and you still don't know what it means, right? And so you watch a video to understand what that paragraph means. And then you go to the next paragraph. That's what I'm talking about. But then for like 6 or 8 different papers every week. And you don't just read, you read and you write. And your writing isn't necessarily a summary of what you've read. Your summary is a critique of what you've read. So if this author is saying X, and this other author is saying Y, what is your position? You cannot say X or Y. You have to say Z, or like, a different. You need to show what you're thinking about it. And I think that was really, really important. And I will definitely encourage it and like recommend that exercise to any person. You don't have to, be in a space like MIT to do that. I think having a community like, MIT where everyone is doing that helps, but you can also sort of do it on your own. I know I was doing that, but, to a less degree, of course, than when I came to grad school. So I think it's a very, very important way of thinking because yes, it will kind of make you aware of whatever you end up designing or drawing. You understand exactly what you're doing, you understand where it's coming from. You won't just be following trends because you realize a lot of people here, we've been trained to draw without necessarily questioning, where it's from. And maybe an example is all the columns that you see in Kumasi and all the Corinthian columns, and you're like, where is that coming from, right? We know they may be Corinthian, but it's like, why are we actually using it in the first place? There's a story to that, and what's that story? So I think knowing the story equips you to make a decision. Maybe you decide to go ahead with it and do it, yes. Or maybe you decide to not. Maybe you do it, but do it differently. The story provides you with that. So you can sort of see how this knowledge and like this way of thinking and, research and quickly, applies into actual design and drawing things on paper or on the computer, right? So I think my time there has been mostly this. I'm still in school, and I have like 2 more semesters left. So my next semester is beginning like next week. And then the last semester, which is in September, from September to December, will be my thesis semester. So that will be like the culmination point where I'm supposed to make a project that speaks to how I think about architecture, but also how I'm thinking about how to practice moving forward, right? As an architect or a designer or whatever I decide to call myself. But I decided to also, in the presentation, I'm bringing this in to show how say my time at MIT hasn't just been for MIT, if that makes sense. So I have found time for other things, and I think it's very important that we find time for other things that are not related to whatever institution that we find ourselves in. That thing that you're interested in, that you do on the weekends, or you do in the evening or early mornings before you go to class or after class, right? I think it's important to push it. And if it is related to what you're studying, all the better. For me, that was the case. So for the past 3-4 years, I have been looking into archives and old material about Ghana and, the creation of this country, Ghana, the pre-colonial era, the colonial era. So when Ghana was Gold Coast and all that. And I've been looking at it in terms of architecture. I like to understand how it changed when we gained independence and why it changed. Who was the one making the changes? All these shifts. That's I think maybe we don't necessarily think about much in the undergrad. Like when I did my undergrad, we weren't talking about a lot of those things. We're sort of just reproducing. But for me, I think it was important to question it. So I remember my very first trip to the development office on KNUST campus, and then to go through drawings of buildings on campus. And then I'll visit those buildings and see how they are today, and take a picture of the current state, take a picture of the archive, put it together, post it on Instagram, right? So that's that like silly hobby of, pairing the past and the present, which at the time didn't mean much. I think opened me up to this whole wealth of knowledge and all these politics like, the creation of space and the creation of architecture. But yeah, you realize it was in many ways a single person's vision. And Nkrumah wanted this new identity for the country, so built all these modernist buildings. And that in itself was good. And I think we all benefit from it, right? We're proud to call ourselves Ghanaian or Kenyan or Tanzanian. Like these projects were done across the African continent. Um, but I think it's also important to understand that as this these new nations were created, they weren't created with everyone's permission. Like not everyone necessarily agreed to be part of this new country. Like think of a remote village somewhere up north and think if the new Ghana country went to ask them that, hey, we are going to form this new country. Do you want to be a part of us? I think it's important to look at all the contradictions and all those other stories that are not spoken about when these large projects are often described. So I began to look into that. I'll post a lot on my social media. I try to use social media as a learning space where I'll just write about things, sometimes even academically, right? And then just put it out there. And I thought it was important to use social media because that's where a lot of us spend our time. So instead of reserving knowledge to be, in the classroom or in that dedicated space, I thought it was very important to bring it outside to a place where everyone, including people who aren't architects, would see and engage with it. And with time, I think people saw it. It was interesting to some folks. I got some good traction and in a way culminated in this highlight event, right? And this is the piece I made for the Venice Biennial of Architecture, which is like the biggest architecture exhibition currently in the whole world. And it was in Venice in Italy. So I was invited by the curator, Leslie Loco, who's Ghanaian Scottish. And yeah, I don't know her personally, but she had seen my work, I think, from somewhere. And she sent me an email. She was like, oh, hey, I think what you're doing is interesting. Would you like to come show? I was like, okay, yeah, this will be a chance to also, think more deeply about what I am doing. And yeah, so I, of course, happily accepted and then did it. So it went up in like May of last year, 2023. So I had to go there and then oversee the installation and all that. And maybe just a line or two about the piece. The piece itself is looking at, like I described, the contradiction between the nation building process and all the other processes of making space that did not get highlighted. So, for example, the nation building process is what we see represented on postcards. It's what we see when we Google Ghana, the Independence, or the Black Star Gates, the Independence Arch, Meridian Hotel, all these big modernist buildings that were built, right? And then all the other ones that weren't highlighted had to do with a more human scale way of making space. So if you go to Makala, you see how they put up the kiosks and they put up the umbrellas and then they make space under it. And it's a very temporal space, but it works, it functions. That's where you get your tomatoes, that's where you get your onions. So I try to highlight those two. And the argument wasn't necessarily one is good or bad, but I think it's important to highlight that, yes, historically, one has been privileged over the other. And that maybe as architects, we should start looking at this a lot more critically and then see how we can learn from both ways of making space as we begin to think about our cities, right? So yeah, this is just like a view of the exhibition panel. So in this, it's important to highlight that when I got the invitation, I thought that the work that I was doing with two other individuals, which we call Post Boss Ghana, fit the theme of the exhibition. So I hit them up. I was like, hey, look, I've been invited for this. I think it'll work really well if we did this together with some of the work that we've already done. So let's say think about it. And so in a way, I was like the lead on the project, right? But at the end of the day, it wasn't me. I wasn't the only one doing the work. I think it's important to highlight that as well. So my two other partners are Manuela Nebuloni. You can maybe see her in the picture here. And then the other guy, Kantinka. Yeah. And yeah, this is just a shot to show how we were thinking of working with all the archival material that we had. So if you see my mouse, this picture here of this guy carrying the crate, and these other pictures here are images of Ghana from the 60s and 70s taken by this photographer who's American. So he came documented, quote unquote, daily life in Ghana. So we found these images, extracted them from online, and then went to Makola, put them there. You know how they put posters, right? So we went and put the pictures, and then came back after 4 or 5 months. And then you realize that, people are trying to take off some parts of it. People had put new things on it. So this Too Sure, uh, this lottery adverts was like something that came after. And I'm bringing this up because I think it's maybe emblematic of how we think about using space. So we weren't going to, set up an exhibition panel and then put these images on it. It was like, okay, how are people displaying images and information currently? And it's the posters. You see them everywhere you go, right? For jobs, for funerals, for weddings, all kinds of things. You just see them there. And so we're like, okay, if people already display information like this, let's just plug into that mode of display and see what happens. So it's really a test. We didn't have any precedent to see how it would, or to even know how it would turn out. There was a lot of uncertainty, but I think in the end, it was a process of discovery, and we're very happy with what came out. So just this past year, also in October, we got a chance to expand this exhibition with the Sharjah Arts Foundation. So Sharjah is in the United Arab Emirates, and it's like maybe 20 to 40 minutes away from Dubai, depending on where you're coming from and where you're going to, in Sharjah. So here they gave us like a larger space, and we essentially expanded the single light box into like multiple light boxes. And then we had a screening, a film that I made here on this other half. And yeah, the theme was still the same, talking about this contradiction between the state-made projects and then, the individual made human scale spaces that you find in the markets and like all other quote unquote informal spaces in the country. So yeah, that's most of it about me. This next segment is like talking about a project which I'm hoping will lead to a discussion, maybe around courage or around how we find courage to do things or embark on things that aren't common or that, very few people are doing. So the map you're looking at is in a town. So this is basically the mountains, a cluster of mountains in the eastern region. And I think most of us might know where Nsawam is. So from Nsawam, there's a road that leads to a town called Adesso. So when you get to Adesso and then you enter the hinterland, is when you come to these mountain clusters. So where I have my mouse now is a very, very small town called Adesso. Sorry, not Adesso, Yaso. So there's another town here, and there's a number of other towns that go around the mountain cluster. And then on top of the mountains, you have a bunch of farms. And even here you can see, so there's a clearing that someone is probably farming corn or cocoa on. So there are all these farms, and there are farmers who live at the foot of the mountain that work on them. So this piece of land that we're talking about is a land that I acquired after my first semester at MIT. So it's coming from savings, and it was kind of a dumb decision in that I didn't think much about it. There was an opportunity to acquire this land, and I sort of just took everything I had and put it in, right? So I acquired this land and I began to think about it, what could be done with this. And I was hoping this would lead to, say, a thesis that I might do for graduate school. But beyond the thesis, become emblematic of how I want to practice. The blue line you see is a pathway that goes from this town all the way to the top of the mountain where the land is. And this was tracked by my sister. So my sister's name is Kpodo, and she's a geographer. So she's been helping me with this because, I wasn't in the country, and yeah, so On the day of the survey, there was a team of 4 people. So there was my sister, my brother, and then these 2 other drone experts who came. So in documenting the land, we essentially there's this thing called an ortho mosaic, where you take like hundreds of images and then you stitch them together to get a very large image. But this image is coming with 3D, like digital, it's called a DEM file, a digital elevation model. So it has like height points. So you can basically generate like a 3-dimensional model of the site. And I mean, all this was done to try to understand the land better, right? From a geographical point of view. But from a historical point of view, if you look at papers and documents and oral accounts from people who live in the mountains and who work on the mountains, you realize that this place 100 years ago was a very thriving cocoa center. So there were a bunch of cocoa trees. And the first people who moved to the towns that I showed you previously were the first cocoa farmers in that area in the eastern region. But 100 years later, I mean today, the land isn't producing as much cocoa as it used to in the past. And so what is happening is that you have all the young people in those communities who are moving away to the cities, right? And so you're left with a bunch of old people who used to be farmers when they're young, but now they cannot farm anymore because they need to go up the mountain. And so when I came here and then I acquired it and I began to meet all the people around, their very first assumptions were, oh, this guy is here to help us. He's coming here to do some projects, because that's how they look at us. And yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the rural and peri-urban surveys that we do in KNUST in second and third years, where you go to the village and they all think, you're there to, do something for them. So it was very much this as well. And I acknowledged it by asking them, what is that thing, that you guys are trying to do? They said, oh, because we're aged, if we could have a road that goes up to the mountain, then, it would be easier for us to bring our crops that we harvest from the mountain down to the towns and then sell them, right? And I thought this was an interesting point because in creating the road, I would add value to my land, but also automatically add value to the land of everyone whose farm was along the road. So it looks green here and it looks like there's nothing here, but there's like maybe 8 different actors here. People own different portions of land along it. So even the act of making a road means you need to go ask them and then talk to them. Are they okay with it? How do they want it to be done? There's all these things that, a single line that you see here on the screen, it means a lot more things in the real world. And I think for me, it's been a process of learning, just going through it, because I didn't exactly know what I would have to do when I made that first down payment for the land, right? But I think having the courage to keep going and hoping that this will lead to some new knowledge is maybe what, kept me going. And so we've reached that stage where there is a land, there is a road that has to be built. But then the question is, how do we build a road? We could go the standard way, where it's like we get someone who's willing to pay for the road. So yeah, in terms of how the road will be built, we could go down the normal route, which we usually do as architects, right? And that is, we wait for a client to come give us money and then we build something. I think this also touches on the conversation we had yesterday. And it was a point that Aubrey raised about how do we actually generate funds to build things. And so I did this exercise where it was like, I know there are about 250 cocoa trees. If I do the math for for every harvest cycle of cocoa, I could make this 6,000 Ghana cedis. And incidentally, the price to hire an excavator or a bulldozer, which could make that road in a day, the day rates for that service is about 6,000 Ghana cedis. So in a way, it's like, yes, the land itself could, pay for the construction of the infrastructure. And I think this way of making buildings, or like of building things, whether it's road, um, structures, whatever, is maybe where my mind is at in terms of how architects should be thinking of how to practice. Because the point is, if we keep waiting for clients or like the government to keep bringing us money to build things, then yes, we will be relegated to building a certain type of architecture. It will mostly be residential buildings, 3-bedroom houses, commercial structures, to the detriment of spaces that are actually needed. So you realize in Ghana, we have very, very little public space because the government has no interest in that. The private individual, of course, also doesn't have much interest in that. So it's like, we as architects, if we are truly makers of space, then maybe we should actually find a way to make that space possible financially, right? And so, yeah, this was the path. There's some more metrics to it. And this is just an illustration showing how, from a design viewpoint, this would happen. So the excavator would like move along that path, and then it would give a clearing large enough for 2 tricycles, which is the vehicle that is used in areas like that mostly, for 2 tricycles to, go side by side. So in a way, this shows how a simple economic activity like cocoa farming could lead to the creation of a certain infrastructure, whether it's a road, a building, a silo, or whatever. And I ended it. This is my last slide, by the way. I'm ending with this to show, in a way, the vision that yes, we can build things as architects, right, with a different model where we actually find a way to channel, whether it's the finances, the stakeholders, and all that. It takes a lot more time, of course, but it does lead to a very different type of architecture, architecture that is actually driven by a certain need and not necessarily by market forces, or like, what the market dictates. So, yeah, I will end here, and yeah, I'm not sure if there are any questions, but thank you.
Please, I have a question.
Okay.
So Courage, you were talking about architects not relying on should I say clients who would lead us to put up certain forms of architecture that may not even be pleasing, but because they are asking for it, we have to produce it for them. So an architecture where the architect is the client. I don't know if I've gotten it right in that manner. But I'm thinking of, say, developers. How about architects who perhaps have a vision? Maybe we want to put up a public square or something, and then we search for developers to come in. I think maybe Kwame Nkrumah tried doing that, but there are also certain blockades in doing this, political blockades. So he wanted to put up this road, and there are instances of rich people, rich developers in Accra who want to put up a road, do an entire road leading to their resort, but then they go to the assemblies and then they are not allowed. And the government doesn't want to do it, but the government is also stopping them from actually doing it. So it's like we are stuck when we use that route as well. I don't know if you get my question.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think it's a very, very valid question, because yes, at the end of the day, the person who's stopping you from doing the road, they're stopping you because they want a mention, they want their names to be on it. So I'm sure in your case, the response was probably like, "Oh, give us the money and we will do it instead of you," right? And I've heard several stories. I was in Western region working on a project, and it was the same situation. There's this man who came to do the road. They were like, "No, but if you give us the money, we'll do it, but you cannot do it," right? So I think if we ask what the issue is, to my point of view, from my point of view, it's actually an ego thing, right? And yeah, I may sound a bit cynical, but it's like, yes, maybe let's find a way to satisfy the ego of, whoever is blocking this to get the project done. Because if it's not done, it's not okay. The problem is still the road. It's a bad road, and everyone loses on the end. But then if you have a political force which is preventing this from happening, then I'm like, okay, yes, let's find a way to satisfy that ego. And I'm not sure how that is done, but maybe there's a process of accountability that can be designed to make sure that even if you give them the money, they still deliver on it, right? That's one option, and I'm not necessarily saying that's what should be done, but I think we need to start maybe thinking of ways of going about that problem. Another situation that many people have like suggested is to become the politician ourselves, right? So it's like you have the intention of building the road. So how do you do it? You basically put yourself in a position where you have a lot of power to be able to, sign off on those projects that you want to be done. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very like valid problem and a very, very valid question for sure. But the reality is like we have those forces and structures in place, and it will make things very slow. We also need to have a lot of patience. By the end of the day, that's really what it is. Yeah, I don't think there's any specific solution really. Yeah.
Okay, I do have a question. Okay, before going on to this question, I would like to introduce myself. So, I'm Derek, currently doing my master's in North Africa. I think I know Courage from this space. So, I'm doing my master's in urbanism, and I have two questions I want to ask. For my first question is, um, I didn't join the call early, but when I joined, I heard Courage talking about the old architecture Kwame Nkrumah wanted to build, the architecture Kwame Nkrumah wanted to do in Ghana. I'd like to know, since you're someone really zooming into that aspect, I wanted to know the difference between those architecture, the post Nkrumah and the pre-Nkrumah architecture. I wanted to know the differences right now in Ghana. All right. And my second, I don't know if you would understand this, but my second question is, why is the government or the private entities not given promote on this sorry, I don't know how to say it in English, but why are they not giving too much attention, Vala? Why are they not giving too much attention to the public spaces being created? Because in different places, example where I am right now, anytime there is a project, um there is the role to create a public space, a green space. But why do we have this problem in Ghana? I just wanted to know something like this. If you would help me, because I'm currently working on I'll be working on my thesis very soon. So I wanted to know this just to adapt to what I'm doing right now. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you for the questions. I can answer the most recent question, the last question you gave. Yes, I think when it comes to what projects gets built or not, yeah, sadly, there's a lot of consideration that is placed on how much revenue that project will generate. So generally, public spaces do not make direct income, if you understand what I mean. Like it's actually a money sink. You put money into it, right? but then it doesn't generate money like a commercial building would. You rent a commercial building, but for the public space, with exception of events and all that, you don't really make much from it. So in that case, it's like if you already have a weak economy, in terms of where you spend for the public benefits, you begin to pick and choose, right? So it's the reason why I don't know, like the Ghanaian government would build highways and interchanges, like just go to the stretch between Nsawam and Accra. They're building so much, like so much. The roads are so wide. It's some of the widest roads I've ever seen, in the whole world. It's quite big, right? And it's a public space. If you think about it, everyone can use it, but they are building it, right? Like the road is a public thing. And the reason why they're building it is because there is a direct impact on the economy. Like if those goods that are going to Burkina Faso from Tema are not able to go because the road is bad, then the country loses money, right? Yeah, but like a public park doesn't have that same kind of impact. So I think, yeah, maybe the framing, if we frame it, like public space, then maybe we should maybe disentangle it. There's like differences between the public spaces. Some public spaces do get a lot of funding, even in a place like Ghana, right? But some public spaces also do not. And I think a good way for telling it apart is what brings money and what does not bring money, or what affects the economy and what seemingly does not affect the economy. And I'm saying seemingly because if you think about it, once we have a lot more public spaces for relaxations and all that, then people actually work better, right? But it's like it doesn't translate directly. So it's not a priority. But in actuality, it does. Like a happy society will actually produce more. Like it's a more productive society. So I think the government might be hesitant on it because the effects cannot be measured directly. So yeah, I mean, I think that's my long-winded answer, but I think that should maybe paint the picture a bit more. I'm trying to remember your first question.
Okay, my first
Could you?
question is, yeah,
Yeah.
the differences between Ghana's architecture post Nkrumah and pre Nkrumah. What are the
Okay. Yeah.
differences you've seen till now? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I think before, Nkrumah became the first prime minister and the first president, we were the Gold Coast. So we're essentially a colony, right? And at the time, there were main centers. Those main centers have not shifted today. There's still, Accra, Kumasi, Takrade. There's still all these key locations. And if you go to all these locations and you go to their very old historic core, and the way to find the old historic core is to go to where the large businesses are, which is, the CBDs. You usually, when you go there, you would find a bunch of these colonial buildings. And colonial buildings is a very broad term, of course, because we were colonized by the British. We will tend to find a lot of British facing buildings or British, design buildings. And that was a mark of their legacy in a very physical form. Like the building was there, you could see it. The British were the ones that built this. But after independence, Nkrumah was like, okay, we should do away with this new idea. Sorry, this old idea. We are a modern country, and we should, in a very physical built way, we should find a language that suits our current state. And so what did Nkrumah do? Nkrumah looked to the Eastern Europe, and then there was all these, modernist buildings being built. And so his whole thing was, let's bring these styles here. And it was called a modern style. So in a way, it worked for this new modern country, right? It fits very perfectly. And the style, like bringing the style meant bringing all these technical experts who came to support the public works department, which were making all the state projects at the time. It also involved bringing all these technical experts into the School of Architecture. At the time, there was only one School of Architecture, which was KNUST, which most of us went to. So there was a time when we had all these, like our teachers were from Eastern Europe. And so if you look at maybe old drawings that they would produce at the time, it was very, very much dictated by that language. There was no one drawing, colonial buildings at the time, because it just wasn't the thing. It wasn't the ish. It wasn't the conversation of the moment. So yeah, I guess the main differences are those, right? But I think there's a third category that we often do not mention, and that category spans the pre-colonial and the post-colonial, in that it has not changed much. Like if you look at pictures of market women from the 1920s and 30s, and you compare it to market women in like the 70s, and even to an extent, if you compare it to market women today, you realize that they still use those devices they were using, the tables and all the, like those quote unquote informal forms of architecture are still, they've been using them, even when Ghana was Gold Coast and Gold Coast became Ghana. It didn't really change. And I think we haven't paid much attention to it. We describe them with all words from our formal viewpoints because we've been taught to describe them as that. We call them informal, right? We call them slums. We call them chaotic, disorganized. And we're always trying to solve it as a problem. It's like, oh yeah, that's street side markets. Let's build a new market for them. And we build a market and they don't go in there and they still stay on the street. Like there's a question there, right? Of course, I'm not trying to romanticize it and be like it's the best kind of it's the best way of inhabiting space. No, 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 that's not what I'm trying to do. But we need to really start looking at them differently, and instead of maybe thinking of them as problems, which we do very instinctively, like it's like, oh yeah, no, that thing is a problem. That thing is a problem. Maybe if we actually start to look maybe a bit closer at why they are doing that, we can maybe start including things on it. Like, why do they sell on the streets? It's more accessible to consumers. And who are the consumers? The people who are in the trucks. So how do we incorporate, more stop spaces, or like, how does the bus stop become a space of commerce? Let's design around that and let's have that conversation. I think that's maybe a more generative way of making space for where we are headed than the logics and the way we think about space currently, which is very, very black and white. It's like, oh, that thing is bad. The good architecture is the big ones. The very expensive ones is what is good architecture. So I think, yeah, we need to really start to disentangle these. And yeah. Thank you.
Gracias.
Okay, thank you very much, Courage. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for whatever you shared with us. I mean, it was very inspiring learning from you. And please, if you have questions for Courage, you can type them in the chat box.
But anyways, Courage, on what you were talking about last, I don't know if you remember, there was a particular year that you had to go to Kpodo Market. It had newly opened, and you studied how these foreign architects had designed it to suit our context. I don't know if back then you had a problem with it, but if I may ask, do you have a problem with it now? I don't know if you remember. We usually sell in streets, and in the ground floor of that space, you have bus stations over there, and people are allowed to sell like how we sell on the streets. Like you enter the places and it's a very big open market. It's the third largest market in Africa, the largest open market in West Africa. But then you enter and you don't feel like you are in an actual building. It's like there's that interconnection with the outside, even though it's like 4 stories high and all. So my question would be, do you think when you look back now, do you see it as a very good architecture, or you beg to differ?
Wow, you're putting me on the spot. But you're referring to the KJTR market, right?
Yes, please. And do you remember you went there back in Kenya?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, exactly. Because you were supposed to design a bus terminal. This was in the 4th year, the very first semester, I believe. I think it was very important that we went there to visit it. If you know KJTR's story, like KJTR has always been a place of commerce, right? Because that's very close to the center of commerce. It's close to a dome, which was where the Asantehene, the very former palace, like this was like 120, 150 years ago. That's where the palace was before it got moved to Meshia. So all the places very, very old, historical. There's a lot of history there. The more recent history of Kejetia was actually a car park. Like Kejetia was a point where the cars would come from like all the villages, you know, and at the time there were villages around or within the Ashanti region, even as far south, you know, for the people who are bringing fish from the coast. So Takrady traders, Axim traders, they all take cars, you know, come up to Kumasi and then come sell. So Kejetia was a car park, and then next to it is the central market, which was the market. But the thing is, transport and trade, you cannot really separate them. And I think we try to separate them in a way that isn't very productive, because you just cannot, like those, you cannot control them. And so if you ask me of my opinion of the Kejetia space, I think for what Kejetia was before, and I'm speaking as someone who used to go through Kejetia like every single day, because I used to pass through it to go to school when I was in primary school. So I know what the old Kejetia was very, very well. I know where everything, like I knew where everything was. I think the new design of it really, really tried to, I think, account for the old Kejetia part. They have the food courts. There was a food court in the old layout of Kejetia. They included the bus stations for some key select locations. That I think maybe could have been a bit more, because the old KJT had a lot of like destinations. The GPRT of TUC office there they were going everywhere. Like KJT was a place where you could go to like all the key locations in Ghana, you understand? But the current KJT doesn't do that. I know they included some, I think, a drop-off terminal in the basement or on the ground level. But I went there just like last week, and that has been taken over by traders. So I think it's been removed. You know, they removed all the, I think they removed all the terminal stations and then gave it to trade. I don't want to be, you know, the guy who's like caught in the past and always talking about the past. Maybe they had to do that because the number of traders were increasing, right? Because I think you also have to think about rates of urbanization, the number of people that are coming to sell, or the number of people that are traders now compared to 10 years ago. It's not the same. So the spaces have to kind of evolve to meet it. So yeah, I mean, it's if we're to judge it, say, based on functional factors, I think like climatically, it works quite well when you're on the upper levels. Like it's very, very well ventilated naturally. Lighting, not so much, because it's such a big structure. You need to provide electric lighting for sure. Otherwise, some spaces would be dark. But the ventilation, I was very impressed by the way they did it. So I guess my only issue with it is the transport aspect of it. There's still a lot of traffic around it, and if you drive there, it's very, very hectic, right? KMA had a plan to move all the cars outside of the CBD of Kumasi. I'm not sure if you knew about this, but that was the plan. So they were going to make a bus terminal somewhere about. They were going to make another one after KMA. They were going to make another one, I think, around Asafo. So the whole idea is that no buses actually come into a Doom KJT area. And so everything there becomes pedestrianized. I can see how, you know, it sounds like a good idea, but realistically, I'm not sure how that would work, because it's like, you know, if you have things, you're carrying things, it might be easier to have a small modes of transport. So maybe not cars, but maybe tricycles or something are able to go. So yeah, you asked me a very specific question. I've just like expanded it, I think, instead of answering it directly. But yeah, I hope that helps.
Yes, please, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Courage. Please, if you have questions for Courage, you can type them in the chat box.